right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. We have a wonderful webinar time period today. It's going to be a roundtable discussion that we're going to be having today. And we've got a bunch of wonderful panelists with us today. And let me get us all up on screen here so that everybody can see us. And excited to be having us here. All right, with us today, we have four wonderful people. We've got Shannon Danzy. Shannon is director at Rally. Shannon is, for anybody who's been around the field, hopefully, or anybody who's been around LinkedIn, hopefully you've seen her. Wonderful leader in our field. Lylah Raynor, the founder and CEO of Logica Research, does fantastic work, very strong volunteer in the industry. And Melissa Geathers. Melissa with Innovate MR. Melissa has such a passionate history in the area of diversity and inclusivity. It's been a delight to get to know these folks as I've been chatting with them here a little bit more this week. And we have a wonderful session. Today, we're going to be just sitting around and talking about the challenges we have around designing research for diversity, inclusivity. We really want to bring to life some of the challenges and issues that everybody are facing, and we want you to participate as well. So on your end, you have a questions section in your webinar's view. If you type in questions, I'm going to be watching those questions as we go through. So instead of a big Q&A at the end, we're going to be talking about different topics as we go through this session. And if you have questions against those topics, throw them out, and then I'll add those in as we moderate through the whole session today. All right. Wonderful. Well, let's get going. Let's get going. Best place to start is the census. The census just came out. What is that really telling us about what does it mean to be representative anymore? And Melissa, I wanted you to kick off this particular topic. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So we saw the census numbers come out this week or in the past week. And the numbers for some of us are not astounding, but for others of us are very wow. More than a third of our nation now lives in counties that the people are majority people of color. Hispanic and Asian populations have experienced the most growth in the past 10 years, quadrupling in size. The 6 largest metros have seen this impact, like Dallas, Atlanta, Orlando, Sacramento, New Orleans, Austin, all counties or DMAs that we all sample very frequently. So now we have to think, what does representation look like now for the US? Now we're looking at less than, in the under 18 group, we're looking at folks, almost a slight majority for people under 18, ticking off those multiracial, multi-ethnic categories. So when we're talking about sampling, how do we then go about that? How do we make sure that we're not just saying, oh, we're just going to augment for African American and Hispanics, when we know now that the country is changing and we can't just add a few in later. So what strategies or solutions are we talking about as an industry to kind of make that happen?
Yeah, it's not a matter of just saying, let's make sure we oversample on something. Everyone needs to be looking at their panels, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, and everyone needs to be in that. So if your panel isn't currently diverse, and if your panel doesn't currently reflect what the census is currently telling us, then you need to clean up shop. And the same thing also applies to when you look around to your colleagues at the company that you're working with, and making sure that you have people who look like the people that you're studying. And if you don't, and you don't have if you don't for whatever reason have the ability to bring that in-house, then making sure that you are bringing on consultants or partners who can help you be reflective, because it's looking, but it's also knowing.
And it's also, yeah, Shannon, I really like what you said there about, making sure that the people who are managing these studies and doing the work look like that. But not only do they look like and are representative of the US and our changing demography, but they also are included, because it's just something different to be diverse, and then inclusion is a totally different discussion. If you don't have a seat at the table, but you're a part of the company and you're not being included in the decisions, then the work doesn't change, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, I think, you know, Melissa, you brought up all these statistics, and kudos to you for having those memorized. So where's your sheet?
I did a lot of homework
last night. Picked up some of the ones I was going to bring up, but yeah, I think the striking thing, you know, to communicate in our research community and to people working on research design and sample design is over half of people under 18 now are people of color. And in the state of California, the total population is greater than half are people of color. And so you couple that with census data where it's a multi-select for the first time, and it's time to make change for all of us in terms of how we think about sample design. And the sample frames that we've been working with aren't really going to apply anymore. And we are going to need to come up with a new way to design sample that it has multi-select. And we're going to need to find ways to communicate with, you know, in our case, clients that this is a shift. And it's the start of something new.
Yeah, that's actually, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think the other thing that is important for people to keep in mind is that, you know, the census tells us, you know, what are the numbers for people who identify as one race and those who identify as multiple races. And it's that multiple races that's super important, because that has grown. I think the number is like over 276% since 2010.
Yes.
And then the other thing is, this is a very good reminder to everyone that these ethnicities and races are not homogeneous. So let's talk about the African American population right now. What numbers have shown is that the numbers for foreign born people who identify as Black, and we can get into a whole separate conversation about terminology, Black, African American, whatever the case might be, but the number of people who selected Black identify as foreign born has increased. That is going to change then the way that you should be targeting and reaching out to. So targeting both from a research standpoint, you need to think about that ahead of time. So when you're recruiting Blacks, what does recruiting Blacks mean? Do you need to talk to more foreign born? Do you need to talk to those who are born in America? So it applies to the way that you design your research, that you recruit your research, but also from a marketing standpoint as well.
Yeah, very good point. Well, so something interesting was brought up here. Lylah, you talked about, you know, the question itself is changing. So it's first time it's multi-select, right? So within our screening questionnaires, if we're thinking about how we go about recruiting a group of people to participate in a research, certainly we should be changing the way we ask the questions as well, correct? Like,
yes.
what should be the new standards? So how should we be thinking about that? Is it just like, oh, go do the census? Like, what's the challenge?
Yeah, I know we all have strong opinions about this, and you know, Shannon and I are on the Idea Council that's part of the Insights Association, and one of the work streams that we're working on is having a recommendation for how to ask those questions, and we'll be coming out with a position piece on that. And it is, you know, it's complicated. We're talking about race and ethnicity, but it also applies to gender. In fact, I think we have 8 different ways we might ask gender. And depending on who your audience is and what you're trying to accomplish and what your research is about, you might ask it a different way. There are ways that we would recommend not asking it. And there's a lot of work to be done to test different ways to ask the question. So there are definitely some recommendations, and there also is just a lot of thought that needs to go into what's appropriate for your study and your audience and what's going to be culturally sensitive.
I think especially with the millennial and Gen Z cohorts right now, the whole issue of what are you going to call me, or what do I want to be called, is especially important or salient. So especially if you're talking or you're going to be doing research with those populations, you do need to be mindful, because it doesn't take that much to turn someone off. So you won't know if someone just decided not to participate in your survey, or decided not to show up to your focus group facility because they decided that you insulted them, or you did not see them in a particular way because either one, you did not ask the question, or two, you asked the question using wrong terminology. So it's not just a matter of the standard questions from 10, 15, 20 years ago. Those are the ones we're carrying forth with. Everything needs to be customized. And if you're not looking at customization based on who it is you're looking to bring into your study and who it is you want to do your study with, you're doing yourself a disservice.
Yeah, very true. So one of the things we do know is that if you put a person in a bad mood, I mean, they might still answer a survey, as an example, just because they're getting paid to do it, as an example, if that's their motivation. But if they're in a bad mood, they're going to score things. Let's say you're doing a concept test. They're going to have lower scores for the concept if they're in a bad mood. So if we do a poor job of screening, or we do a poor format, we're going to get poor scores as a bias in the research, rather than a true representation of what that particular study is about. So I think it's a really good point. Not only does it affect how we recruit and the type of people we recruit, but it also affects the rest of the research and the answers and the insights that we're able to pull from that as well. So any tips on how to be more sensitive in the way we ask questions and mitigate? I mean, there's obviously the bias that we as researchers all have and we put into research. So any tips on how to be more sensitive?
Yeah, I think that we definitely need to look at those demographic questions. Is there a real reason to have them at the beginning of a survey rather than at the end of a survey? We don't want someone to come in and then be turned off, as Shannon said, by how the question is posed, and then it will skew the rest of their experience with the survey and therefore skew your data. Do we really need to just have tick boxes? Is it something that we need to look into? Is it having more availability for open ends for people to self-identify, which I know is going to cause some folks to have some conversations about open-end coding and all of that. But if we truly want the sample to be representative, we definitely need to give people the option to say who they are, because it only enriches our research in the end. I think we also need to look at who's designing the questionnaires, to make sure that we're asking questions that aren't inherently classist, that aren't inherently exclusionary, just because we're not thinking of all the different types of folks that might answer.
I think research on research is going to be ridiculously important nowadays. I think Lylah can speak to that based on what we're doing with the Insights Association right now. Really, at the end of the day, that's probably one of the best ways to check that we're asking questions in the right way, and that they're being interpreted in the way that we intend for them to be interpreted. Other ways are to reach out to those, community groups that are on the ground. So the nonprofits that are actually engaging with these communities on a regular basis. So they're going to be more in tune to the vernacular that's being used than, say, even we are, because we are still removed as strangers versus those community groups which are actually engaging with them on a regular basis. So I think that's another way to check. And then I think the last thing is that people meaning us as research companies or those who are in this space, just need to begin to work more together and share what it is that we're learning with each other, so that we are working more as an industry versus as separate entities, which isn't ever going to help the larger industry work better.
Yeah, that shareable information is going to be super valuable. I mean, if our goal as a society is to take care of each other, that's going to be critical. Certainly, I appreciate it. So let's a couple of questions we've got coming in here. One is on the area of demographics, the global nature. Is there anything is there anything being done in terms of, like, the way we ask racial diversity-oriented questions here in the United States might be quite different than how you do it in other countries. Is that, is this community, Lylah, you mentioned the Insights Association, is that being thought about already? How is that being addressed?
Yeah, so I want to pick up too on what Shannon, you were saying about the need to collaborate, because it's the need to collaborate. Here we are in the United States, and there's a lot of work to be done to do the research on research, but also connecting with other organizations, SMR, Marketing Research Society, and other research organizations in other countries. So the research on research needs to be done here, and what we learn here may or may not, and probably isn't in many cases, applicable to other countries. And so that work needs to be done there and shared. So I know there's work being done in the UK about what does it mean to have nationally representative sample, and having some commitment to agreeing on what those guidelines are, or at least sharing how you're defining nationally representative sample. And that's something that we could probably learn from here. And right now, we're just very focused on how we ask some of these demographic questions and how it impacts sample design. It's been 10 years since the last census, and now we all have a lot more information to integrate. So I also would say for younger populations, just even knowing when to ask them to identify or self-identify, being sensitive to even whether they want to answer all these questions or any of them, and getting out of our traditional demographic questions completely might be appropriate for them. And I know that might make people's heads explode when you think about target marketing and so on, but I think everything should be on the table for being curious about and exploring.
I want to hear Melissa's answer, because she was starting to laugh, and I was starting to laugh when that question was asked. So Melissa.
I saw your face, Shannon. I was like, oh yeah, please don't ask UK people from the UK if they're African American. That just doesn't work. You have these conversations with your clients, and and with the survey designers and the programmers, and I know everyone wants to have like this standard way of doing things that works across all places. It just isn't that way, like Shannon mentioned before, with the African American community, the Black community, no group is a monolith. So you really have to look into being more customizable, maybe not asking questions that identify where a person comes. Maybe they would respond more to saying what their ancestry is, what their heritage is, rather than whether they're Black or Latino, Latinx. Some Latino, Latinx folks don't like Latinx. I think all of it is up for grabs right now, as I was saying. We have such an opportunity to redefine how we do our research, to make it more inclusive, that, and then we do have to keep in mind that not everywhere is the same. Canada has a large Indigenous population, but it's not the same as the Indigenous population here in the US or in the Caribbean or anywhere else in the world. So we really need to be focused on learning and grabbing on those resources for the people who are in the field, for the people who work in those communities, to get that information from them so that we can then inform our research.
Yeah, everything needs to be approached individually. And I think part of the question was about the Insights Association, so that that paper that Lylah was talking about. So for the Insights Association Idea Council, we're focusing on the US first, because to focus on it globally is such a big lift. We'd have to do it by country, and then in some cases by region within the country. So we're just focusing on the US first, and then we're going to start working outwards from there.
Very good. Well, talking about working outwards then, can we get beyond demographics as well? So let's talk about the rest of accessibility, inclusivity, getting to people who may have, access issues, right? You've got, people who lack equity, poorer cultures without the robust technology access, et cetera, so forth. When we talk about accessibility and inclusivity, what are some of the top considerations we have to be aware of today in those areas?
So I would say accessibility is a demographic question. So to the conversation earlier, there are sometimes where you might and should be asking those questions, and there are some times where those questions maybe should just be added to the end regardless, so you can get a sense as to who it is that you're talking to, because then it might course correct something that you're doing for your end client. But you know, I specialize in online qualitative. It's amazing the few, if any, of the online qualitative platforms that actually consider whether somebody can see something, can hear something, can type something. And if that's the case, which I know it is the case, I guess I'm talking in hypothetical, then you are leaving out a pretty sizable part of the population, and it's saying to them, whether they know it or not, that their opinion is invaluable. In some cases, their opinion might be more valuable, especially if you're talking about like shopping in a store. You know, if a person is wheelchair bound or can't see, then that is going to completely sway potentially part of the learnings from your study. But you didn't include them because your platform didn't allow for them to participate in it, and that's something and that's why I'm saying accessibility should be thought of as, should be on the tip of your tongue just as much as any other demographic question is.
Absolutely. And then speaking to the accessibility point that you just made, Shannon, thinking about when we finally get back to in-person qual, right? You know, making sure the spaces are accessible for folks that are differently abled, for folks that are larger bodied, for folks that maybe don't have transportation, so maybe they need to be on a bus line. You know, things like that all impact who we reach, right? So, and then who we include in the discussions.
And so I think a tip is just to think broadly, or maybe another way to phrase it is not to think at all and prepare for everything. And the more specific of the target that you're looking to reach out to, then think about, okay, well, what are the potential barriers that this target might have? So if it's low income, say African Americans, and you're in Chicago, then yes, you probably do want to think about how accessible in terms of transportation, as Melissa was saying, it is going to be to get to that facility. There's been multiple times when I've been brought on to moderate a study, and last second you get a whole bunch of cancellations, and you know, the recruiters are asking why, and a person's like, well, I can't get there in time because this bus line is down, or I didn't realize how far away it is. So I think you need to think broadly, and then you also need to think specifically and look around at if you're talking qual, looking around at where you're doing it, whether it's in person or online, and making sure that everybody has, you know, almost as equal an opportunity to participate and not feel an odd man out, not feel welcome, not feel wanted when they get there. But the same thing applies for you know, quantitative and survey platforms as well. I think they're doing a little bit better job in terms of accessibility, but there's still things that need to be considered there as well.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, there are businesses who, you know, are serving people who live further away, don't have access to cars, and need to get them in. And sending cabs and Ubers is a way to get them into wherever the location is, because otherwise they won't get there at all. And I think for research, we need, again, to think expansively and include those costs in the research. So if you need to provide transportation, if you need to, you know, in other cases, maybe you're doing research among women who have infants and they can't leave them alone, how do you do that? Like, just having that broader perspective on what the needs are of your recipients. And for quantitative research, I do think, you know, we haven't been able to do in-person intercepts either for this last year. And so trying to get around that for hard to reach populations online. And I think one of the things we need to look at is having mixed methodologies and being comfortable with that to reach our target audiences, and being more flexible than maybe a traditional, you know, purist approach might have been, to be able to allow everybody to have a voice in the research as well.
And there's small steps that can be done. I mean, if you look at what, say, like LinkedIn or Twitter is doing, they give you the option, or they encourage you to sort of describe if you're uploading a picture or a video. It should, that took a while to get there, and maybe we should have been doing it all this time. That prompt is there. So I think we need to start including those prompts or those reminders for ourselves as well, so that, you know, we are able to build little by little. We're doing more and more.
Right, because those little things do matter. Even with a font survey online, if we have video but there's no description for someone who's maybe using a read aloud website, then they can't see the video, they can't interact with it. If we have audio, like I remember back in the day, there was that click here if you could hear this sound, you know, to make sure that all of your system was working. But if there's no option for someone who's hard of hearing or deaf to participate in that, then they can't participate in the survey. So I think all those small things really matter.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the small things. Like we recently had a study where video was watching a video was an important part of it. And, you know, in years past, we used to approach that by how do we design this questionnaire to make sure people aren't cheating, right? How do we make sure they really watch the video so it's not, and you're really thinking about people as, okay, got to make sure I'm weeding out my cheaters. And I think we're seeing a progression now of a different way of approaching that, more towards a progression of saying, okay, how do I ensure that everybody wants to watch and can see and has the accessibility to see this? And what do I do if they can't? Then how do I take care of them? Rather than, oh, I'm just kicking them out, right? So any insider information on other types of solutions we've seen working, or tips and tricks on maybe how to improve inclusivity? Other thoughts? I'm kind of trying to.
Yeah, I mean, I know that, you know, a lot of it is too working with clients who are demanding the research and, you know, are requiring the research, and working with our technology providers to integrate those changes. So some of those changes really almost need to be driven from the client. So accessibility for people who can't see surveys, for example. That change came about because of brands needing to make those changes on their websites, and so being required to do it on surveys as well. And so some of it is business driven in a way, and needing to communicate with our clients where the business need is, which is across the board. I mean, we're going to miss reaching and hearing from huge populations of people without these changes. And the technology exists, you know, it is there.
Sure.
There are experts in our field, and experts that are not in our field, that specialize in accessibility. So it can be as simple, I mean, there's a cost associated with it, but it can be as simple as extending invitations to those people to have them come in and, you know, rip things up and let you know what things need to be improved, what things are low-hanging fruit versus things that are going to require investments. And I think that's a step. And if you're building something from scratch, like a new platform, then involve those persons or designers who have that capability from the beginning, so that it's already built in versus having to tweak your technology, which can be more expensive on the back end.
We've got a couple of questions in from the audience now about topics of the census, whether we think that the census really needs to be completely overhauled, as well as, you know, what do we think is the English language Eurocentric model really appropriate for getting to people, and how do we really ensure our sample is really representative, which kind of brings me around to the topic we had been discussing earlier, which is asset framing. And for audience members who don't know what asset framing is, I'll give you a little definition here. asset framing is really defining people or communities or teams by their aspirations or contributions rather than by their challenges or deficits, right? So it's essentially flipping that. So instead of trying to classify people by what they are, you actually classify them more or organize them or think about them more from their aspirations or contributions. So thoughts on, what the questions here is, how do we, do things need overhauled? Do we need a really complete change? Or, is maybe asset framing a way to get there? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, asset framing is huge in the social impact space, which is where I've recently moved into. But even before I moved to Raleigh, where I'm at right now, there's been multiple times where I've had to give a friendly challenge to clients and their discussion guides about the way things are framed, or even in questionnaires. Do you really want to be sitting there as a low-income African-American person and be asked a question about, well, what can we do to help improve the circumstances of people who live below the poverty line? Yes, I might fit into that category, but you're talking to me like almost as if it's an insult, talking to me as if I am an other, or I put myself into this situation purposefully and I don't have a way out. So just the way we've been talking about looking at the way that we phrase and ask our questions for recruitment, it's also looking at the way we talk with, and it's with, not at, the persons that we are doing our research with. Because again, it can easily shut someone down, it can turn someone off, but it's just not respectful. You don't want to be in that situation yourself. So why put the person that you're talking with in that situation too? So I think it's just, again, it's all about taking a step back and looking at things with fresh eyes. And if you don't believe you have those fresh eyes, and if you don't believe that you have the expertise or the know-how to identify that, then you need to bring in someone else, either someone else on your team. It could be the person sitting at, it could be the secretary or the person sitting at your front desk. They have fresh eyes. They have expertise in ways that you might know, or it's bringing in someone who does specialize in that so that they can call those things out for you.
Yes.
She said it all.
Said it all.
Yeah. For asset framing, I think it does play such a big role in how we are looking at having these conversations with respondents, with people. It makes me cringe every time I see the words underrepresented or at-risk youth and those things, because it actually puts the onus on the person who's in the situation rather than trying to see them as who they are, to see them as their circumstances. And I think we can try and reframe that for ourselves as like, this person comes with challenges, or these respondents come with challenges because we have to do certain things. But I think we need to put the onus on ourselves to say there's unmet needs that we are not reaching here, so that our respondents are, our pool is representative, our people are representative in our surveys, and then that puts it back on us to do the work.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I have really focused on, my business really serves a lot of financial services and fintech companies, and personally been focused on financial inclusion, and that's partly why I got involved in this project. And the number of times that everybody's well-meaning, but the number of times that we need to say, we need to rephrase this because this question assumes that the people responding are making over $250,000 a year, and the median household income in the United States is $60,000. And there's a lot of assumptions baked into questions, the way that they're asked, and that's kind of a constant process. But I know some of the questions here about you know, are we, like Shannon, you said, ripping everything apart, you know, are we tearing everything apart to rebuild it? And in some sense, I think, yeah, like, yes, there are some things that we all can do to start, but this is a restart, and there is a lot to do, and it's not going to be, and it's going to be ongoing, you know, like we have the new census information, and that's important, and that's one way to look at it, but we also need to think more expansively beyond that to just, you know, who are the people we're talking to as people, not by their demographic characteristics. And it may mean rethinking how we even target for marketing purposes, and really, you know, really questioning some of our assumptions in research and research design.
And Greg, you had made the comparison earlier about how the industry has spent time and is still spending time on making sure that, you know, our surveys are as efficient as possible. This is another form of efficiency, right? So we do those things to make sure that our surveys and our questionnaires or whatever the case might be are as efficient as possible so that we get the best output, right? So if you're not doing what we've been talking about all this time as well, then you really aren't getting the best output, because one, you're not getting the best people in for your research, which means that you're not getting the best responses, which means that you're not getting the best conclusions to help your client at the end of the day. And I think if you haven't been thinking about it that way, then it's time to begin to think about it that way.
Yeah, I agree. And that was one of the things that excited me when we were talking about just like some of the start and stop things, like what some of the things you can start doing today. And, you know, and this whole idea of realizing that all of us have unconscious bias, you know, by the way we were born, who we grew up with, how our parents were, everything about us drove some type of unconscious bias into our behavior. And so you had mentioned getting fresh eyes on things. I mean, what are some of the best practices? Because in like getting fresh eyes to uncover some of our unconscious biases, any recommendations that we can give people?
By recognizing that nobody has fresh eyes, really.
Right.
Fair enough. I
mean, you have to be humble, right? So
yes.
I might say that I specialize in multicultural markets, and I do, but I also know that I've tried to make myself aware every single time I approach a study that there is something that I am blind to. And the way that I try to help with that is, one, recognize that I'm never going to fully solve it, because there's no perfect human on the face of the earth. But what I can do is educate myself as possible by reading books, by reading articles, by watching documentaries. I can watch a fiction television show and learn something from it, but also be humble enough to know that I do need to bring in partners to supplement and check what I think I'm checking in of myself. So I think it starts by being humble and recognizing that you do not know everything, and that you cannot not have a bias or some sort of blind spot.
Absolutely, I agree. I don't think that any of us can go in saying we can find all the gotchas. There's absolutely no way. We all have unconscious bias regardless of who we are. And I think, to Shannon's point, asking for help when you need it, and then those could be the people that are sitting around you that are working with you, because we all have diverse perspectives. And we were talking about being inclusive, which means we're including more folks in the conversation that have different perspectives from us. And that in itself can do a lot of good. There are a lot of organizations out there on LinkedIn and Insights Association that know folks that are good with these things that we may not be good with, that we could take the moment to say, hey, Lylah, do you know someone who specializes in making sure our spaces are accessible? And she might have one, and then that will help us get to the audience that we need. I think just absolutely recognizing that this is a constant thing that's learning, just like the demographics in the census are continuously changing. As the world changes, we will have to grow and evolve and learn and adapt. And then the other thing I would say is, don't be offended if you make a mistake and somebody points it out and says, oh, you just did that wrong. take it as what it was meant to be, because a lot of people are just well-intentioned and like, hey, just so you know, you may not want to say these particular words when referring to this particular group. And then say, you know what, that's my bad. I shouldn't have done that. I now know better, because we don't know it all. We really don't.
Yeah, I have to say I make the same mistake a lot. Like just simple things like just is it a race or is it ethnicity? How many times have I messed that same thing up? I know it. I've trained myself on it, but my colleagues will call me out on it often, and I have to be, like you said, humble enough to go, yep, you're right. I got to work on that, and then I have to actually work on it. And I think that's the next big topic area, which is training, right? So clearly, training is required. Constant training is helpful, but the reality is everybody's super busy. We got managers on here; their team is like flat out all the time, and they feel flat out all the time. So how do we get training in? How do we showcase how important that is? What are some opportunities that we have or advice that we can give people in order to get better training?
I think one thing that Shannon said that speaks to the training piece is, I don't know that it necessarily also always has to be a formal training, but things like reading books, watching a TV show that has a cast that doesn't look like you might be a great way to learn a couple of things. All that stuff is learning, even if it doesn't feel like you're sitting in a training room or classroom situation. It still means that you're gathering new information that you can then apply to your research, to your life overall. I think being open to that kind of passive learning, if your company wants to do something like a book club, or maybe have a coffee break where you discuss something in the news or some topic that maybe is a little bit hard, but you can talk about it for 15 minutes and then you can learn something. It doesn't really have to be a huge 2 days seclusionary, everybody log off of your laptops and let's talk about DEI for 2 days. It doesn't have to be that. I think small steps go a long way.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Lylah.
I was just going to say, I also just think it's a shift in perspective for organizations. We're researchers, we're curious people, we're interested, we want to learn, right? And I would say it's part of our job. So just like you learn a methodology or a new platform or a new tool, you're going to learn about different groups, and you're going to learn about how to be culturally sensitive. This is part of our learning agenda. This is part of what we need to be able to do to be able to design research and help our clients. So I guess from my perspective, it's just it's something that we all have to do, and whether we all figure out what works for our organizations, but and our people. But I think it's culturally having that mindset of this is part of our jobs.
You'd be surprised at how many people are willing to talk to your organization and not charge you, because they want people to be more educated on these topics and subjects. But even if they do charge something, it's probably going to be worth it, because then you are dispensing education in a way. You are sort of forcing education within your organization, because there is a downside to relying or assuming that everyone on your staff is going to learn on their own. We know, there's definitely people who aren't going to do it. So having some balance between the encouragement of the informal learning, which I think is very important. So it has to be from a top-down perspective. So your C-suite, if you work at a large company, needs to sort of build in the culture of continual learning, but also forcing that learning by having, whether it's once a month or whatever, to Lylah's point, works for your organization, some formal education that happens There's also a bucket load of information already out there in the form of webinars that have been done by companies like InsightsNow, by organizations like Insights Association or the QRCA or the MRS if we're talking internationally. There are also increasing number of affinity groups such as Insights in Color here in the US that have their own webinars, but also have their own written pieces, thought pieces on various subjects. So I think it's a matter of, again, encouraging it internally, sharing, and asking people to begin to share things internally, but also tapping what's out there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And just we're getting a lot of questions about recommended sources. I'll let you know, we actually had that conversation quickly before as we were prepping for this. And when we send the follow-up email from this webinar time, we'll include a bunch of links in there, and certainly the Idea Council, that there's a great document been put together there with lots of extra links inside that. So that PDF will be referenced in the follow-up there. Okay, so we're getting close to the end of our window of time here. So take-home message. It's been a great discussion today, but let's wrap by going around the team here. What's your best advice? You know, if there's one thing that they can do today that'll have a significant impact, what's that one thing that they should be doing? Lylah, I'm going to pick on you. So you want to start?
Questions are the answer.
There you go.
Ask questions, encourage questions in your organization, you know, question the way that you've been doing things, and be ready to, you know, not start over, but really start this new phase of how we go about asking demographic questions, designing sample, working together as an organization, bringing in diverse perspectives, and really making it safe for people to ask those questions and move forward in a different way.
I couldn't agree more. Excellent. All right, Melissa?
Okay, so I would say, first of all, diversity, any type of diversity, inclusion is a fact of life now. This is not something that's going away. This is something that our industry absolutely has to take the time to do the work around. There's no longer a discussion where we have these conversations once in a while and we forget about it, we put the box away, and so that's the first thing. Like we have to continue the conversations, and those conversations have to turn into actions, and they have to have real world impact. And the other thing I would say, something you could do to take away, is definitely pick up and look at the resource list that we're going to send. I think that all of the sources that are on there can definitely give you some information and some tools for you to have these conversations within your company, with your clients, and that is going to go very, very, very far in making sure that we're being inclusive in all of what we do here.
Yeah, very good. Excellent. And Shannon, want to wrap it
up by myself? I would say, you know, just be humble. It's okay not to know, but you need to acknowledge that you don't know everything. But what's not okay is continuing to not know. So however is best for you to solve that for yourself, starting with, and then for those you work with, then I encourage you to go forth and do that.
Yeah. My goodness, I think that's going to have to be like a new T-shirt, right? It's okay to not know, but it's not okay to continue to not know. I love it, love it. That's a great quote. So, all right, well, thank you very much for your time. This has been a great discussion. Looking forward to continued more discussions as well. So certainly feel free, reach out to these folks. You know, lots of people on watching this today, so certainly take the time, reach out, get to know these team members, take a look at the reference material, get to know those people. A lot about being able to improve our ability to drive diversity and inclusivity is all about connecting with other people. And so if you're new to this space, get out there, get connected to these people. We're all easy to get to know. Just jump in, say hello, ask some questions, and that'll be a fantastic start. All right, thank you all for your time. All right, good job today. Excellent. All right, have a wonderful afternoon. I'll see you all later.